Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is democracy, theory and practice in India. And with this, I would also like to introduce our subject expert, Dr. Sushila Kaushik, retired professor of political science, University of Delhi. So I welcome her and also request her to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Lucy. We will today talk in terms of the working of democracy in our own country. Our country is somewhat peculiar. When we started our independent experiment about 60 years back, we had a lot of discussions about what type of democracy we should have. While it was taken for granted that what we will have will be only a democratic model of government, and not only government but also values imbibed and motivating the government or governing the government, but also what type of values we will have in order to promote greater democracy in our country. We also had a lot of discussions created by us in other parts of the world, wherein there were many doubts whether India, with all its problems, its size, its population, its variety and its backwardness, considering all these things, whether democracy would ever be a successful experiment in India. In fact, there are a lot of skeptics, doubtful people, even in Britain, when they granted the independence to us. While one Prime Minister, namely Attlee, who presided over 1947 in England after the war, was willing and happy to go along with us and give us independence. There was the earlier Prime Minister of England, known as Winston Churchill, who definitely, a strong man, definitely did not want to give us the independence. And he made a statement like, India will never succeed in democracy, India will collapse very soon, it cannot exist as an independent country and a democratic country. But in the midst of all this, we did get our independence. We did switch on to a democratic model. We very consciously adopted democratic values and practices. We were aware what are the challenges we may have in holding democracy in this country, but we were also positive about that we will overcome those challenges and democracy will succeed in this country. After 60 years of being independent and adopting a republican constitution and practicing democracy with all its basic institutions like rule of law, rights, elections, self-government and the freedom of all types, we have survived, not only survived very strongly in the past 60 years. In fact, even while in and around us, there were other countries which are collapsing under the pressure of something or other, when there were military dictatorship which could come in between, or there were natural calamities or something else which made them resort to giving up democracy and resorting to a little authoritarian methods, or the adoption of an ideology which itself was authoritarian. India, in the midst of all that, stood ground and had a liberal, constitutional, democratic model in all these 60 years. So that is where these skeptics at that particular time really failed. There are others, American writers who came up in the course of 1950s and 60s who found that India was getting into deepening economic crisis, food crisis, growth was not taking place, or agricultural was failing. Then they came out with all types of predictions like there is a quiet crisis growing up in India. In fact, one author called his book as A Quiet Crisis in India, and he said that India will not be able to cope up with its economic challenges, so the Indian democracy will have to yield to an authoritarian practice or some other method. We did not. We did not yield. Our democracy still continued in the midst of all this economic crisis. We had wars, we had challenges, then also we did not yield. With the democracy, the war was also being fought very successfully in this country. None of these events really led to the emergence of a very authoritarian government in this country. There were authoritarian tendencies in our politics, but these were overcome and democracy really prevailed over them, so that we have continued to have a consistently a democratic value, set of democratic values. Now, democracy by itself does not mean just the constitutional framework. We do have a democratic constitutional framework, but the spirit behind the constitution, the type of rights and duties which the constitution gives, the provisions it makes, the type of institutions that the constitution has created in our country, all these things add up to making a democracy a living reality in our country. So, with all our problems still, with all our challenges still, with all challenges to democratic rights and their exercise still, we can in general say that India continues to be a democracy and will continue to be a democracy for its own negative as well as positive reasons. The very size of India, the huge size of India, the very fact that India lives in its villages. There were more than 7 lakhs villages when we became independent in 1947. The very fact that we came out of a British colonial rule which tries to unite and unify India, but the British colonial rule could not really go deeper than many of the cities. So, it confined, the colonial rule mainly confined itself to the cities and the major cities, and in the villages, where education backwardness were all rampant, lack of education backwardness were rampant, those were itself became the safeguard of democratic institutions values which we had inherited for a very long time. India was well known, especially the southern parts of India, was very well known for what we call the village republics model, where there is a panchayat model, where the elders of the villages assembling under a tree decided many of the important issues in the villages. So, it is they who were the decisive authorities and not the government which could be ruling either from Delhi or from London or even from the state, even from the presidency capitals as such. So, this sort of a democracy where, because the British rule did not penetrate into the villages, continued to preserve the democratic institutions, the village republics, where the leaders were chosen by very many methods which has continued from, as I say, from the Chola dynasty in South India, where the republics were a very common feature, where the kings, even though we had a monarchy, the kings were extremely democratic and lived in close touch with the population and had the desires of the population as their mandate. Often we even have stories of the kings chopping their own fingers off or burning their own feet off because they had done a mistake which went against, even if it is one person in the population. So, those are the various traditions and stories which we had inherited in our country. And these stories and traditions continue to be there, but some of those systems may not be prevalent anymore, but the values themselves still continue. Because even today in many parts of India, there are the constitutionally recognized panchayats, especially after the 72nd, 73rd amendment. But without that, or besides that, or in addition to that, we also have the old model of panch joining together and deciding many of these, the elders joining up together, deciding quite a few of the traditions of the villages. So, that's why there is this democratic values, democratic way, participatory way of doing things in the small hamlets of India continuing. So, these were all the type of democratic values India had. So, now the leaders of the Indian national movement, recognizing this inheritance of India, are not believing that India is only a monarchical rule. Many of the Westerners really described us as if we had all along been under some monarchy or other, under some rulers or other, under some dynasty or other in various parts of India. Some of these rulers were very authoritarian and even very cruel, while some of those were very democratic and extremely conscious of their duties as such. We had both varieties. But we were always told India is good enough only for a monarchy. India has been always used to one man's rule and it cannot be democratic. No, we have really proved ourselves over a period of time that we have given up those monarchical rule and that we have moved on to a democratic rule during the transition period. But even when the British were still ruling India before 47, there were very many portions of India, which really did not come directly under the British rule. We still had a lot of sections in Indian populations or Indian geography, where we had Nawabs and Rajas and princely rulers who were still ruling. So, it is not that totally the entire country came under the influence of Britain, but the fact is the values, the British values were the dominant values which were there at the time when we formulated our constitution, the Constituent Assembly in India. So, the Constituent Assembly by and large adopted the British values, British ideas of democratic values, equality, fraternity, liberty of the French type, as well as the concept of what you call rule of law. This rule of law was an extremely important aspect of the British traditions, because Britain definitely does not have a written constitution. It inherited its political values more by the common traditions, by the common law of England, more by historically passing them on rather than in any court or judiciary enforcing it as a written constitution. So, we also adopted many of those common traditions, but now we put them and documented them as part of our constitution to make them sure in this country. Because we had different practices and different traditions from historically and from various parts of India, it became very necessary for us to write a written constitution, and in that written constitution write some of our values very clearly down, so that in the future nothing can happen which upsets these values in our country. So, this is where for us the most important aspect of our value was the relationship between the state and the individual. How do we know, how do we define a democracy? How do we know, how do we define an authoritarian government? Basically on the basis of what is the relationship between the state and the individual. What type of rights are given by the state to the individuals, what type of rights the individuals are able to exercise in the country as such. So, this relationship really decides whether we have a democracy or an authoritarian rule in any particular country at any particular point. So, the freedom, the various types of rights which is given to individual, even if it is given by the state in the form of a constitution, still it is something which we already have, which is being inscribed. That is why by and large the Indian forefathers, the constitution founders adopted what we call the Lockean system of the John Locke theory of democracy and the state, which the British, one of the British political philosophers enunciated, namely John Locke did, where we talked in terms of the state and the individual and the rights, one where it could be put very simply as a limited state. There is a state, the state has the power, the state has ultimately the supreme body, but the powers of the state is limited in the context of the individual, a constitutional type of government rather than a totalitarian type of government. So, Lockean theory talks about this limited state, limited authority of the state, and believes that when you have the rights and liberty or any other type of freedom given to us, these are freedoms and the rights which are already in existence. It is not that the state creates those rights, it is that the state recognizes those rights. They are natural rights, they are with us because we are born as human beings. But what the state does is, the state recognizes them, guarantees them, maintains them, enforces them. So, the state merely acts as a protector of those rights and not really a giver of those rights. So, that is an important limitation on the state. That is where it differs from the Hobbes view, or it differs from Rousseau's view later on in the contract theory, as we call it. In Hobbes' view, it was all given by the state. In Rousseau's view, nothing is done by the state. We have a via media in the form of a Locke's view. So, this is where we have our notions of individual liberty and individual's rights. We have notions of equality between human beings and the concept of rule of law. Namely, in the eyes of justice, in the eyes of judiciary, every man and woman are equal. There is no difference between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or a man and a woman. All of them are equal in the eyes of the law. That is what we call the concept of rule of law. It does not mean that the law prevails. What it means is we are all equal in the eyes of the law. So, unless it is proved that we have done some offense or done some crime, we are equal to anybody else in this country. So, the law takes care to see that we are protected as equals. This concept of rule of law is very fundamental to a democracy. It is the biggest contribution the British made to the world, and we have adopted the rule of law as a very important notion of our democratic values and the basis in this country. So, that in terms limits the state power, because if the state has to recognize I am equal to another person, in the eyes of law me and another person are the same, that immediately limits the state from acting arbitrarily or outside of its powers. So, in order to keep all these democratic values guaranteed and protected, we need to have a written constitution. Unlike the British is the only country in the world which has an unwritten constitution, as we call, or which does not have a written constitution. We have documented them into our written constitution and then enforced it or reinforced it by putting a preamble to our constitution. As one of the very important political scientists pointed out, the most important aspect of the Indian constitution is its preamble. It is a preamble. Many constitutions in the country, in the world, does not have a preamble, but we in India have a preamble, and the preamble talks very clearly about the nature of our constitution, the nature of our political process, the nature of our polity in precise form, when it says that we the people of India solemnly give ourselves a sovereign democratic republic. Later on we also added by an amendment sovereign democratic socialist republic. But in the beginning when we had it, it is a sovereign democratic secular republic which is given the preamble. So, this preamble of one long sentence, extremely important sentence, governs the entire constitution which follows thereafter. It decides the spirit of the constitution. The others which follows later on are the letter of the constitution. The spirit of the constitution comes from the preamble. That is why the preamble becomes an extremely important element of Indian constitution, and still today that governs the Indian spirit of a democracy in our country. So, under the basis of this, on the limited state power and the relationship between the state power and individual rights, we have very many of these features in our constitution. We can take up some of these features and see how they try to promote democracy in this country. Like a written constitution, as I said right now, a written constitution by itself is a guarantee against a whimsical changes and amendments which any particular ruler or a political party at any particular time may be tempted to bring about. A written constitution stands as a referral document whenever we have a doubt. Whenever the judiciary is trying to enforce any particular judgment or anything, it can always refer back to the constitution and satisfy itself that it is on the correct lines. So, a written constitution is both a reference as well as a guarantee to our rights in this particular country. The second thing is a type of a government. The type of government we adopted is the parliamentary form of government. We could have had a presidential form of government. There were examples when we became independent, like the United States, they had a presidential form of government, but we adopted a parliamentary form of government to us, which it doesn't split the government into three separate branches unrelated to each other. In the United States, there are three different portions of the government, namely executive, legislature and judiciary, but each one stands by itself and nothing acts, there is no coordination, each one acts as a monitor of the other. We did not take up this sort of a conflict-ridden posture. We took in terms of a parliamentary form of government, where the executive and legislature are not merely closely related to each other, but we also have an accountability, a type of proposition where the executive is accountable to the parliament The parliament is responsible to the parliament, both individually and collectively. The cabinet is responsible and accountable to the parliament. And the parliament has the representatives of the people, elected by the people once in 5 years, usually, normally. So, which means it believes in a system of accountability and participation, and so the executive cannot really become unwieldy or very powerful here, because the parliament acts as a check on this. We also have a separation of powers like United States has, but our judiciary, it stands independent like in the United States and stands strong. Over a period of time, it has emerged now in India that the ultimate interpreter of any event or any doubt in this country is judiciary. Even today, whenever there is a doubt, whenever there is any problem, any crisis, any conflict, we refer it back to judiciary, and there, with a series of levels of judiciary, we can go up on appeal up to the Supreme Court, which is the highest body of the judiciary. There is a tremendous faith in judiciary in this country, tremendous credibility for judiciary in this country. So, we do believe that democracy will still prevail in this country, thanks to the wise judgment and postures which judiciary takes up. So, the rights and the other types of new constitutional framework, the judiciary really stands up as a great guardian, particularly the Supreme Court. We also have another way of enforcing our democratic values in another context, namely federalism. We can have a unitary form of government like England has or many other countries have, but we opted to have federal context. Again, we have seen it before too. India being a diverse country with different type of culture, different type of inheritances and different type of historical background, with a huge civilizational heritage which we have, this diversity needs to be maintained. Not merely maintained, it has to be guaranteed, which could be done only when the political power is given to this diversity. Federalism is a form of government in which we distribute, decentralize our governmental powers by dividing the country into so many units and making each unit somewhat independent within its own sphere. So, federalism and the division of powers is strong guarantee to preserving the pluralistic nature of our society, particularly historical legacy, the linguistic legacy, the cultural legacy, and many other types of diversities we have had over a period of time. Also leads to developmental of people, because the development is close by, the government and the people are closer to each other in a federal setup other than in a unitary setup as such. The Constitution also preserves a democracy and recognizes it and preserves it and reinforces it and guarantees it. In another section, the most important section again for democracy, on fundamental rights. It very clearly has a very long section on fundamental rights, which we believe is almost the pivot around which the Constitution also revolves, wherein the various rights, the right to freedom, the right to free movement, right to free life, the right to livelihood, the right to follow one's own religion, the right to preach one's own religion, follow one's own religion, are all very important rights which have been given to us as a part of our democracy. Because democracy definitely believes in the right to free speech, right to free movement, right to free associations. You can join up with people and form association. It believes in the right to choose the government, the political rights, democratic rights, right to stand in the election, be part of the government, right to choose the election and send our representatives, right to withdraw them, recall them if you want to, in the form of another fresh elections. So, these are all various rights associated with our fundamental rights, which the Constitution has really stood up for. Of late, we have even increased these rights. We have now got a right to information, because the accountability and democratic nature of our system can be reinforced only when we get into a doubt and we ask for the information. That is the latest one. We have the Right to Information Act. We also have the right to education. Despite all these years, many people in India, quite a few sections of Indian population still does not have the education, is still illiterate or not too well literate. So, it becomes a right to education on their part to ask for this right, and the state is bound to maintain and protect this right of every Indian citizen as such. So, we have expanded on the fundamental rights, but this portion itself remains extremely strong still. That is why we have so many political associations, NGOs, political parties, and our elections go on very well, because based on these political rights which you have under fundamental rights. So, free, fair, regular, periodical elections is not merely a mechanism, but it is even our right. We can demand it. If by any chance it is postponed, we can ask why. And so, all these years India has had an extremely good record on this by and large, of holding regular elections regularly at the time when it is due. It was only once we had a little bit of postponement in the election, that too only by 1 year, and that was also because what Constitution itself tells us, under condition of emergency, we can delay the elections by a period of 2 years. And in any state, if it could not be done, we can delay it by a period of 6 months. But we have not resorted to it too often. Only once the elections were postponed, not by 2 years, but by 1 year, because the democratic forces asserted themselves in the country that the authorities concerned who declared the emergency had to come down, abridge it into only 1 year. So, the election which was due was done by the next year itself in this country. So, our democracy was preserved that way and kept alive. Universal adult suffrage. This is another one where India has started with a lot of criticism about. Our own leaders and founding fathers were very sure there is nothing wrong about giving universal adult suffrage to all the people in India, irrespective of their age or their educational qualification, their property qualification, their many other qualifications. There are many countries in the world which gives some sort of a restrictions or qualification, but India chose not to put any qualification. In fact, many people said Indians at that particular point when we became independent were by and large illiterate or not very well educated, by and large extremely poor, and so had no stake in the country because they were poor. People like C. Wright Mills long back believed only if you hold a property you will have a stake in the nation. We believed everybody has a stake in the nation, so we adopted universal adult franchise, and from the very first election which was done 1 year after we became independent or a republic, namely in 1952, there was a good percentage of Indian population, particularly from the backward, rural, uneducated sections, which went forward and voted in the elections, showing thereby they have a stake in the governance of this country and the democracy in the country. Once again, the freedom of association, the freedom to think, the freedom to move around, free movement, and the freedom to associate ourselves is reflected in the political parties in a democracy. India is one democracy where we have not restricted this freedom or the right to 1 or 2 political parties like in the other countries. We have a multiple party system, we have the national parties, we have the state parties, we have regional parties, we have parties which come up at the time of elections and very often also vanish after the election, which means that there is a freedom to form associations, freedom to bring our points together, freedom to group ourselves, put across a point of view and see whether this point of view has any support from the population. So, multiple party system and federal and state parties, regional parties, all this reflects on the fulfillment and the proper access to and the utilization of our rights, political rights in our country. So, also as I said, the universal adult suffrage was given without any restriction, but then the Constitution very specifically we reinforce our rule of law concept by saying there will be no discrimination on the basis of caste, creed, class or sex in our practices, political practices. This has been extremely useful phenomenon, especially in a country like ours, where the there were multi-religious, where there has been a history of a little bit of communal politics, where in our religion caste is extremely important, and over historically we have had a hierarchy of castes, where a lot of caste discrimination, where we have caste hierarchies, where a lot of caste practices, and where we have tremendous amount of patriarchy and very strong traditions. With such a background around, it is extremely important to reinforce that all this is not right, that the caste hierarchy or the religious divide or the patriarchal forces or any other type of sect and creed, which India had enormous amount then and even now it has, this multiplicity should not come in the way of the individual's freedom, individual's right. This is the reinforcing one. So, by using this particular section in our fundamental rights, the state subsequently has been able to bring about a lot of social legislations and social reforms, particularly gender reforms, and the judiciary has been able to adopt a lot of decisions which in one way or other cases where it has tried to harm either some caste at the lower level or some religions at the minority level or the women's issues on the basis of patriarchy and male chauvinism. These are issues which the judiciary has been able to solve, get and preserve the rule of law for all the low, vulnerable, depressed sections of our society. Then the religious freedom, I think this has been extremely important to us then and important to us now, and will continue perhaps to a few years, namely our whole notion of secularism. Though we said in our preamble itself declared, saying we are a secular, sovereign, democratic, secular republic, it's still this particular notion has come in for a lot of discussion, debate and criticism in the course of the last 50-60 years, being divided by some very, very powerful religions in the world, and being the birthplace of a lot of religions, Asia being one and India particularly shares it, we have some very major religions in our country. So, this has given birth to often some sort of divide, clashes, skirmishes among the people themselves, religious quarrels, going to the extent of communalism, fundamentalism, traditionalism, and even ruining our democracy at times and depriving the rights of certain sections of the population has been quite a challenge to India's democracy. So, the fundamental rights and the maintenance of secularism there in our constitution has helped in every now and then bringing India back to its rule of law and democratic equality concepts by reinforcing the secular notions of India. This requires another big debate, but I am not getting into that right now, but all that is secularism is definitely a fundamental reality of India's democracy, and that is how it still continues to be a place where various religions live in peace, pursue their pursuits, and we continue to be not a single religious state like you have a few states in the world. We never adopted any religious denomination, even if one particular religion could be a majority religion in this country with 70% following it. Even then India does not have a religious title in its constitutional title, like otherwise Pakistan, Bangladesh, Israel, many others have it. We have not adopted it. We have positively been against it. One can get into, then there is a section the constitution talks in terms of directive principles of state policy. So, what could not get into fundamental rights for one reason or other then has been mentioned as a directive principles of state policy, wherein the states in various parts of India should try and bring about these rights and keep these values in view when they make their legislations or policies or administrative measures in the future. Though much of these directive principles of state policy cannot become a law by itself, it cannot become a policy framework, and then if there is no clash on it, differences on it, it could even be adopted by India as a whole. But as of right now, they only remain as principles of state policy. They are not legislations by themselves. So, if any state tries to make any legislation on the basis of it, it becomes a point of discussion, but as democratic principles go, these directive principles of state policy has helped us to bring about a lot of social legislations in this country, social welfare measures in this country, particularly for the poor, the vulnerable, the depressed, and the lesser sections of our population, the unempowered sections of our population like SC, ST, women. These are sections which could be given some sort of a succor by under this directive principles of state policy. Some issues like reservation or other measures could come about under this directive principles of state policy. So, India then emerges in the past 60 years as one of those countries which has the maximum number of social legislations. At every small point, at every citing of a particular injustice to any section of the population, our government has come out very liberally with social legislations for particularly looking after the depressed sections of the population. Because this is one of the unfortunate legacies which we had, because we have been ruled by colonial rule for a long time. And before that also, India was a divided nation with very many rulers and others. Plus, India has had a very long traditions, customs and practices. Many of them had become very rigid and very well cemented. So, in order to get rid of them or bring some sort of a relief to those who suffered under them, under these hierarchies, we had to bring a lot of social legislations. So, it said that India has the maximum amount of social legislations, moving from the social to economic to political, any sphere which we require, so that every section of India's population can benefit from these social legislations. In many other countries also they have these measures, but then they do not go through merely by a legislation. In this country, being the size being very large, customs being very different, traditions have been very, very strong, and literacy level still has not become 100%. And the rural side still remains as a hinterland and has not been able to be brought into full development. We need to bring about many of these measures or social reliefs through a legislation rather than merely through an administrative measure or a policy as such. So, our policies very often have been derived from our legislations. Law definitely has become an extremely important instrument of social change in this country. It is always law is an instrument of social change, but in our country we have resorted to it more often than many other countries would do, because law alone can bring about many of these social changes here because of inherent rigidity of traditions and customs and very long history as such and diversity in our midst. So, social legislations have been quite a lot in this country to promote the empowerment and the rights and the participation and the access to of rights to very many sections like what we now call scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, women, depressed sections, old age people and many others who have not been otherwise able to utilize our constitutional rights just by their existence. So, you need to have some other inputs added into it, so that these sections could have their access, and this has come through social legislation, this has come through reservation, this has come to certain sections of the population, and special attention, special privileges to certain sections of the population, so that they can, from being unequal sections, they can move up to an equal section. Because unless you have equality, you cannot have access. Access may give you equality, but to even have the access, you need to have equality. And so, reservation and other types of legislations try to give this equality, rule of law to those sections which are finding themselves unable to access the provisions which are made in our constitution or elsewhere as a democratic rights. We have not been merely happy with providing these social legislations and just leaving it for them to prevail in this country. We have taken more measures to see that this comes true, and there are special agencies for them. So, that is where over a period of time we have got various agencies to protect the various minor sections of our population or depressed sections of the population. So, the one thing which the Indian democracy did was to organize various agencies to promote and protect the rights of these sections of the population. We have the national and state commissions for the SC and ST. We have all these acts, we have all the social legislations against atrocities against these sections, caste atrocities especially. We have the reservation for political rights, but still, or even employment and education, we have the protection, but even then it still has not been able to reach all of them. So, we have to have a guardian agency or monitoring agency which has come in the form of national and state commissions for SCs and STs. Following that, and they every year they make a report, they talk about what is happening in the country. If there are any cases of atrocity, they make a report on it and tell us how the country is still had to move forward to bring about this equality, both in mind as well as in action. The changed mindset, how much have we got it, or we still are struggling with that. And we also, if anything happens in any part of India, these commissions immediately intervene and try to set it right and bring it up and highlight these incidents and support the victims, so the victims can then go before the judiciary and also get some sort of redressal of their grievances. So, first we had this national state commissions for SC and ST. Now, we followed it up with national and state commissions for women. So, we have national commission for women in Delhi, then we have state commissions for women in every state capital. Almost all the states have them, some were a little delayed, but still we have the state commissions for women. Some were very powerful, some were not as yet. It is also getting into a little bit of political controversies, because every ruling party wants to have its own commissions, which is wrong. Because if an independent commissions, whether it is SC/ST or women or any other, should stand the ground, whichever is the political party which is ruling, even if it is a change in the political party, that should not lead to the position or the power or the actions of these commissions. That is where we have a little challenge still on that, when the political parties, the ruling parties try to intervene in them, change their members and try to bring about what they think are pliable, their own supportive persons. But if the commissions are strong, then it does not matter who brings whom, because the commission will really stand up to it. So, we also have minorities commission. Since we still have a lot of problems, communal issues in our country, minorities commission to protect and promote the security as well as the rights of people belong to the various minorities. We have strong minorities in this country, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, Jains, Buddhists, and many others who are all denoted by the constitution as our minorities in this country. But all these deal with specific sets of people. It talks about the atrocities or denial of rights or some other type of harm which has been done, which is being done to the members of their sections, their communities, their groups. Their powers are limited up to that jurisdiction of those people who are within the members. But there are issues which go beyond the community, which are human rights issues, which is democratic rights issues. Does not matter which religion they belong to, sometimes you have the human rights being denied, like you have sometimes riots take place. It need not be always communal riot, it could be just political riots or any other riot. Law and order situation is ruined. The individuals, those who protest on some issues, their rights are being abridged. The ruler that may adopt a very strong attitude towards the protesters, and the police atrocities are plenty in this country. We have been seeing it, the brutalization, as we say, of the police force is taking place in all parts of India. We see almost every day in the television somewhere some young student or an innocent girl is being harmed or even beaten up or dragged along and pulled along by the hair. These are sort of stuffs which go beyond our religion or our caste or our communities. It is really human. So, to take up these issues, India after the 1993 Vienna Conference on Human Rights we have also formulated what you call the National Commission for Human Rights, what you call NHRC, National Human Rights Commission, which is with very powerful membership there. Its chairman always has been a retired judge of the Supreme Court. Not less than that will be a member of, will be the chairman of this NHRC. So, government always has to look towards a retired person who is willing to take up these positions. Sometimes we do not have one who is not occupying anything else. So, we have to have an independent, strong man as the chairman of NHRC as well as the members of NHRC. It takes care that all parts of India, all religions of India, all sections of India are represented there. In the past 10 years or more, the NHRC has emerged as a very, very strong institution. Its opinions are respected, its interference is feared, and when it gives a report to the parliament, it is taken seriously. So, we do have powerful protective agencies in this country. Even our women's rights commissions, our SC/ST commissions, when they make a report and send it, the government of the day has to go through them and read them because they are well publicized. And these days, with all this computer and other types of methods around, we have a lot of well circulated documents in our country. Anybody can take up and ask for the right to information from the government on this basis. So, we do have over a period of time a lot of institutions which have come up in this country, particularly the right to information, the judicial reform called PIL. Anybody can take to a court an issue requiring attention, even if that particular victim of that case is not in a position to do it. So, when you had an accident and a laborer died, when nobody took up the issue, then a PIL came out, and the existing Chief Justice of India, Justice Bhagwati, recognized this as a proper method of entertaining a case. So, from that time onwards, we had this public interest litigation, that is the PIL. So, even if the person who has been affected does not go to the court, anybody can take his case up and go to the court. Need not follow any procedure, go straight and ask for a hearing from the Supreme Court of India. This, though started as an innovation, today has become part of our legal procedures. So, we have enormous amount of PIL coming up before our courts, enormous amount of RTI coming up before our RTI courts. We have got almost many courts which are coming up besides the real judiciary, para-judiciary system is there in this country. So, we do find good growth, flourishing in a way of democratic practices in this country. In fact, these are practices which are not even there in many of the well-known democracies in the world, like PIL and RTI and all are not there even in Britain or United States, which we hold as models of democracy. But our country has taken a lot of strides in this, and our judiciary has been the biggest supporter to us in these various innovative ventures. In spite of it, in spite of so much of things we have done, there is still a lot of dissatisfaction in our country, and we still keep saying that democracy is very weak in our country. We still keep comparing ourselves to Western democracies like Britain and United States and think that they are better democracy than ours. That things happen much better there, that the state is much more responsive in those countries to people's grievances. One complaint here or one thing there, one grievance here, the state immediately responds. Or even before the grievance takes place or they take an appeal, the state itself understands it and tries to do things. In our country still, we have a lot of grievances of the people go unattended. A lot of them are not even able to express their grievances. When you express their grievances, and we have a very, very powerful media right now in this country, more powerful than any other country. We have a variety of media in English as well as Hindi, as well as in all the vernacular languages, the state languages, and we have a very powerful visual media in the form of TV all over India, and they have been making a lot of programs to bring about, to highlight, show the grievances of the people as well as what they suffer from, either by way of malnutrition, lack of education or cleanliness, or many health and many other types of issues where the state should have taken more pains, should have got rid of it by now, or at least should now listen to and get rid of it. In spite of all this improvement in our public and private domains in our country, we still have a lot of challenges for our rights, especially the human rights, but also the rights, fundamental rights, as well as the social rights which has been given to us by our social legislations, still being not fulfilled. They seem to have a lot of limitations still. One is the tendency for authoritarian leadership. We did have an emergency, which is a very unfortunate. It's a very black period in our history for about 2 years between 1975 and 77, which blot was removed only because through an election, and so the democracy got itself restored after the election. But the election itself is a point in favor of democracy in this country, because the emergency just couldn't continue indefinitely. It had to be put an end to. That's a plus point for the democratic practices of our country. But this authoritarian leadership resorted to once in 75, 77. It's difficult for the future people to do it because they have understood that India will not take up this sort of an emergency or denial of fundamental rights or suspension of fundamental rights for too long. But very often we resort to this at the state level when we suspend some of our democratic practices like legislature, parliament or assembly meeting, and the governor's rules comes up, which also is not much of a good example for us to do. Though this also gradually is now getting reduced because the people are disapproving of these governor's rules or president's rule, as you call. Elected parliament members, good or bad, inefficient or efficient, they should continue till they face the elections again. At times we have this, but it's not a continuous one, it's not all over India. But at times the opposition parties look very weak, because the party which is ruling seems to be getting a steamrolling majority. There were occasions when we had in our parliament the ruling party getting 2/3 majority. When Rajiv Gandhi was chosen and the Congress government came back in 1985, we had a steamrolling majority of 2/3. People were happy, but then this is not good for a democracy. Democracy should definitely have a good opposition party to keep a check and to express the views of the people, which may not always be to the liking of the government. We do have a lot of social unrest every now and then coming up. India is definitely a big country, huge country with a tremendous amount of social divides and population and backwardness. We have 29 states in this country as of at present, so the social unrest is bound to be there. Unlike a small country, a very homogeneous country, India is a very heterogeneous country, and so with the result, and a hierarchically oriented country, so we do have social unrest very often, and that sometimes makes us feel upset, because in a social unrest one section definitely gets ruined and their access to rights are affected. In this social unrest, we also have a lot of features like fundamentalism. Though India is by and large a very liberal country where democratic values ultimately prevail, and the fundamentalists have always not been very unsuccessful and have been defeated, they have never succeeded in this country, but the force itself keeps cropping up every now and then, throwing challenge to the unity, homogeneity, the country's democratic practices. It tries to distract us from our development and following democracy. So to that extent, it sometimes is upsetting and unnerving, but then one is also very sure these are short-term challenges which will be overcome by the democracy. The same is true about communal rights, communalism, which keeps coming up because it's politically very profitable for the parties or the politicians to create some sort of event. It's a sort of an event management in this country, but which comes in the way of our development. Same is true about caste atrocities. Though we have abolished caste, a lot of castes come up, economically, but still occasionally we have this now. The majoritarianism, especially religious majoritarianism, political majoritarianism, when there is a strong political party which gets more than 2/3 or of the parliamentary or legislative assembly, they try to believe that they are the rulers, which is not. Because there is a very strong other presence where they did not have their presence, that is a challenge to them. Caste atrocity, communal atrocity, fundamentalism, all this is concerned. But above all, we also find the traditions continue. Despite our education, mobility, occupational mobility, people moving from one part of India to another part of India, you now find, previously we only used to see movement one way up, people from the south because of their superior educational faculties, early exposure to the British advantages and development, used to move to the north in terms of positions or industrial or any other. Now we find it, the movement is many ways, both ways and many ways. We find a lot of people from Punjab and other places going and occupying positions and earning their livelihood in any part of India. A lot of mobility by way of tourism. People from various parts of India are able to see the other parts of India and understand what is India and what is the diversity of India. So we have all these various types of practices which have come up because of our policies. Still you find a Kap Panchayat somewhere. Still you find the traditions asserting themselves somewhere. We still find the young committing suicide. We still find the young couples being butchered. We still find the right to associate, the right to free movement of the youngsters being questioned in this country. So we still have a lot of loopholes, we still have a lot of gaps, we still have to work very hard on our democracy. Our older generations will have to preserve the democracy not merely for themselves but also for the young, because more than 40% of our population is the young. They are the future. So this is where the traditions have to give way to liberal, democratic, equality values, secular values in this country for which our constitution stands. That's our religion. Constitution is our Bible, constitution is our religion, and democracy is our value system and the goal. Rights is the goal. So I think we have to move further and make ourselves strong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you friends again for watching. Have a wonderful day ahead.